What if 10 of the foods that shape the entire biblical world are almost completely missing from the modern conversation about eating well? Not the famous ones, not the olive oil, the figs, the honey, the almonds. Those get written about constantly. I mean, the ones underneath them. The stew that cost a man his inheritance. The herb eaten specifically because it tasted bad. The seed that only releases its active compound if you never heat it. Here is what almost nobody notices about them. Every one of these foods carries two payloads at once. There is what it does inside a body, which modern research can now describe in some detail. And there is what it meant to the people eating it, which no laboratory measures at all. Today we walk through 10 of them. Stay for number 6, a food nearly every adult in the ancient world could digest comfortably, and that a large share of adults today cannot, for a reason that has nothing to do with the food. And number 4 is the only item here that people begged for, received in overwhelming abundance, and then wish they had never asked for. One word before we begin. None of this is medical advice, and Scripture does not promise that any food cures a disease. What it gives us is a pattern, and the pattern is worth looking at closely. Let us begin. Number 10. Lentils, the stew that cost a man his inheritance. Esau comes in from the field exhausted and finds his brother cooking. Genesis calls it a red stew of lentils. Esau asks for it, and Jacob names his price: the birthright, the double portion, the entire inheritance of the firstborn. Esau agrees. He eats, he drinks, he gets up, and he walks away. Then the text adds one flat, devastating line. So Esau despised his birthright. Before it was a lesson about impulse, it was a pot of lentils that smelled good to a hungry man. That is the whole engine of the story, not a rare delicacy. The cheapest food in the house at the exact moment somebody could not wait. Lentils earn their place regardless. They deliver plant protein alongside substantial soluble fiber, folate, potassium, and iron, and they carry resistant starch, which passes into the colon undigested and feeds the bacteria living there. Their carbohydrate releases slowly, which is why a bowl of lentils sits differently than a bowl of refined starch. Here's the part that gets missed. The iron in lentils is non-Hem iron, which a body absorbs poorly on its own. Absorption rises substantially when vitamin C is present in the same meal. The vegetables and herbs served alongside were not garnish. They were doing invisible work nobody in that kitchen could have named. So cook them with onion, herbs, and something acidic. And notice what the story is actually warning about. Esau was not wrong to be hungry. He was wrong about what his hunger was worth. Number 9. Spelt, the bread a prophet was commanded to eat under siege. In Ezekiel chapter 4, the prophet receives one of the strangest instructions in Scripture. Take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Put them in one vessel, make bread from the mixture, weigh out the portion, and eat it by measure day after day, lying on his side as a sign against Jerusalem. That was not a recipe. It was a picture of scarcity. Nobody combines 6 different grains and legumes into one loaf because it tastes good. You do it because there's not enough of any single one. Ezekiel was performing a famine. Spelt itself is an ancient relative of modern wheat, grown across the region for thousands of years. Whole spelt keeps its bran and germ, and with them the fiber, magnesium, zinc, and B vitamins that heavy milling removes. It is worth saying plainly that spelt is a wheat. It contains gluten. It is not safe for anyone with celiac disease, and no ancient pedigree changes that. Now the irony that is difficult to unsee. Ezekiel's loaf was a ration commanded as a sign of judgment and hunger. That same combination now sells in supermarkets as premium wellness bread at a premium price. The famine loaf became a luxury good. Eat whole spelt as flour, berries, or porridge. And remember what it was: bread made from whatever was left, which turned out to be enough. Number 8. Vinegar. The sour dish that welcomed a foreigner to the table. Ruth is a Moabite widow, gleaning at the edge of a field that is not hers, in a country that is not hers, under a law permitting her only what the harvesters drop. Then Boaz says something that changes the shape of her life. Come here, eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the vinegar. It is a small line and easy to read past, but the vinegar is the point. It was the common table condiment of working people, sour wine, the bowl everybody dipped into. Boaz did not offer her something special. He offered her the ordinary dish from the same bowl, which is a far larger thing. Inclusion is not a separate plate. It is the same plate. Vinegar is dilute acetic acid, and acetic acid has been studied more seriously than most people expect. Several small controlled trials have found that vinegar taken with a carbohydrate meal lowers the blood glucose rise that follows, likely by slowing gastric emptying and interfering with the enzymes that break starch down. But the detail matters enormously. That effect belongs to the meal it accompanies. Drinking vinegar alone as a tonic misses the mechanism entirely, and undiluted vinegar can damage tooth enamel and irritate the esophagus. So use it the way Ruth did, on the food, with the bread, at the same table as everyone else. Number 7. Cumin, mint, and dill, the herbs that exposed a blind spot. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus makes an accusation specific enough that it must have landed hard. You tithe mint and dill and cumin, he says, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These were men counting individual herb leaves to be certain they gave away exactly 1/10. The precision was real. The proportion was catastrophic. Notice what the accusation assumes. For it to work at all, every listener had to know that mint, dill, and cumin sat in every household, valuable enough to tithe, small enough to count, not exotic, on the shelf, and they are more than flavor. Cumin carries cuminaldehyde and a range of aromatic compounds. Dill was used traditionally for digestive complaints across the whole region. Mint has the strongest modern file by far. Peppermint oil has been tested in randomized controlled trials for irritable bowel syndrome and has shown reductions in abdominal pain and overall symptom scores, making it one of the better supported herbal findings in the literature. Here is the distinction almost nobody makes. Those trials used enteric-coated peppermint oil capsules at a defined dose, built to survive the stomach and release further down. A cup of peppermint tea is a pleasant drink. It is not the same intervention and should not be expected to do the same thing. Use all three generously for flavor. And hear the warning underneath. It is possible to be exact about the small thing and completely wrong about the large one. Number 6. Milk and curds. The meal set before 3 strangers. 3 visitors arrive at Abraham's tent in the heat of the day. He runs to meet them, tells Sarah to make bread quickly, sends a servant for a calf, and then Genesis records what he set out. Curds and milk of the calf, and he'd stood by under the tree while they ate. He does not know yet who they are. He is simply a man putting out the best he has for people passing through. Curds, not just milk. That single word is the whole item. Milk in that world did not stay milk for long. There was no refrigeration. It soured, curdled, and separated within hours, and the household ate it in exactly that state, as curds, as soured milk, as the fermented products that became yogurt and cheese. That was not a compromise. That was the food. And here is the answer I promised you. Most human adults on Earth lose the ability to produce lactase after childhood. Globally, lactose intolerance is not the exception. It is the norm. Fermentation solves it. The bacteria consume much of the lactose before anyone eats it, which is why many people who cannot manage a glass of milk handle yogurt and aged cheese without trouble. Fermented dairy also supplies calcium, protein, and vitamin K2. Nobody in that tent knew any of this. They simply ate what the heat had already done to the milk, and it worked. Number 5. The mustard seed. The smallest thing on this list, on purpose. Jesus reaches for it more than once, always for the same reason. The kingdom of heaven, he says, is like a grain of mustard seed, the smallest of seeds, which becomes a tree where the birds come and nest. And to his disciples after they fail, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could tell this mountain to move. The comparison only works because every listener had held one. A mustard seed is roughly a millimeter across. You could lose it in the seam of your palm. The whole image depends on the gap between what it looks like and what it does. That gap is chemical as well as agricultural. Mustard seed contains a compound called zinegrin, which on its own does very little. The seed also carries an enzyme, myrosinase, stored separately from it. When the seed is crushed or chewed, the two finally meet, and the reaction produces allyl isothiocyanate, the sharp, nose-clearing bite of mustard, and the compound that isothiocyanate research has concentrated on. Now the part that changes how you use it. Myrosinase is destroyed by heat. Add mustard seed early and cook it thoroughly, and the enzyme is gone before the conversion can happen. Crush the seed cold or stir it in at the very end, and the reaction happens on your tongue instead. Something almost too small to see, holding a reaction in two separate halves, waiting to be broken open. Number 4, quail. The food a nation demanded and then regretted. This is the one I asked you to stay for. In Numbers chapter 11, the people in the wilderness are sick of manna. They weep. They remember Egypt. They demand meat. And they get it. Not a modest provision, but an overwhelming one. A wind drives quail in from the sea until the birds lie deep around the camp, and the people spend a day, a night, and another day gathering them. Then the text turns. While the meat was still between their teeth, a plague struck the camp. Psalm 106 gives the line that has echoed ever since. He gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. Quail is genuinely good food, lean, dense protein with B12, iron, selenium, and phosphorus. For people who had gone a long time without, it was a legitimate and valuable source of nourishment. Here is the clinical observation, and it needs a firm hedge. When a body deprived for a long period is suddenly loaded with a large quantity of food, the metabolic shift can itself be dangerous. Modern medicine has a name for this, refeeding syndrome, and hospitals treat it seriously. We cannot diagnose an event from 3,000 years ago, and it would be irresponsible to try. But the shape of the story and the shape of the physiology sit uncomfortably close together. Eat protein steadily rather than in a sudden flood. And notice what the psalm actually says. They received precisely what they asked for. Number 3, wine. The food Scripture praises and warns about in the same breath. Psalm 104 lists it among the gifts of God, wine that gladdens the heart of man. The first recorded sign at Cana is water made into wine, and the steward remarks that the good wine has been saved until last. At the final meal, Jesus takes the cup. Paul tells Timothy to use a little wine for his stomach. It runs through the entire text, and the same text is unflinching about the other side. Wine is a mocker. Strong drink is raging. Proverbs describes in detail exactly what the end of that night looks like. No food in Scripture is handled with this much two-sidedness, which is precisely why it belongs on a list about body and soul. Now, the honest state of the evidence, because this is moved and most content has not caught up. For decades, the story was that moderate wine drinking protected the heart, with the polyphenols in grape skin, including resveratrol, receiving the credit. Those compounds are real, but the protective finding itself has weakened substantially under better study designs, which found that earlier comparisons had grouped former drinkers who quit for health reasons together with lifelong abstainers. Alcohol is also classified as a carcinogen. So here's the reveal. The polyphenols people point to are in the grape, not in the alcohol. They are available from whole grapes with none of the risk attached. Scripture called it a gift, and it called it a mocker. It was right about both. Number 2, bitter herbs, the only food commanded to taste bad. The Passover instruction in Exodus chapter 12 is precise. The lamb roasted, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. Not as a side dish or a matter of preference, but as a requirement. A meal built to be repeated every year, containing something deliberately unpleasant, so the taste itself would carry the memory of slavery. Think about how strange that is. Nearly every food tradition on earth drifts toward sweetness. This one legislated bitterness into the most important meal of the year and refused to let anybody soften it. The plants used across the region, chicory, endive, dandelion, horseradish, romaine, carry the compounds responsible for that taste. Sesquiterpene lactones in the chicory family, glucosinolates in horseradish, and bitterness is not a defect. Bitter compounds activate receptors on the tongue and further down the digestive tract that stimulate saliva, bile flow, and digestive secretions. There is a reason traditional medicine across many unrelated cultures independently arrived at bitter tonics taken before a meal. Here is what almost nobody realizes. Over the last century, commercial plant breeding has systematically removed bitterness from vegetables because shoppers reject bitter produce. Lettuce, cucumber, chicory, grapefruit, Brussels sprouts, all bred milder. But in many cases, the bitter compounds were the bioactive ones. We selected for palatability and quietly discarded the pharmacology. So eat the bitter leaves, and notice what the commandment was protecting. Some things should not be made easier to swallow. Number 1, salt, the covenant you cannot see. Salt is not a food anyone eats by itself, and that is exactly why it ends this list. In Leviticus, every grain offering is to be seasoned with salt, and the phrase used is remarkable: the salt of the covenant of your God. In Numbers, the arrangement with Aaron is called a covenant of salt forever. In 2 Kings, Elisha heals a poisoned spring by casting salt into it. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not tell his listeners to go and acquire salt. He tells them they are the salt of the earth. In a world with no refrigeration, salt was the difference between food and rot. It was how meat survived a journey and how a household survived a winter. To call a covenant of salt was to say it would not spoil. Physiologically, sodium is not optional. It governs fluid balance, nerve conduction, and muscle contraction, and no body runs without it. The modern problem is not that salt is poison. It is that the ratio has inverted. Ancient diets were high in potassium from vegetables, legumes, and fruit, and comparatively low in sodium. The modern pattern is the reverse, and much of the blood pressure research points at that ratio rather than at sodium alone. And here is the part that surprises people. In most modern diets, the large majority of sodium never comes from the salt shaker. It comes from processed and packaged food, added long before anything reached the kitchen. You cannot fix this by moving the shaker further down the table. You fix it by eating food that was not salted in a factory. Which brings us back to the sentence: if the salt loses its savor, what is it good for? Salt does not work by being noticed. It works by changing everything it touches. 10 foods, 10 moments, and the same double structure underneath every one of them. Each of these does something measurable in a body: resistant starch in the lentils, acetic acid in the vinegar, isothiocyanate in the crushed seed, bacteria in the soured milk. And each one also carried something no measurement reaches: a birthright, a welcome, a warning, a memory of slavery, a covenant. The people eating them did not separate those two things, and that may be the part worth taking. They had no supplements, no labels, no laboratories. They had food that came from somewhere they could point to, eaten with people they knew, in a rhythm that included giving thanks before anybody picked anything up. None of this is medicine, and I want to be clear about that. Nothing on this list replaces treatment, rest, or the judgment of someone who knows your history. Scripture does not promise otherwise, and neither do I. But here's the small thing to do this week. Pick one. Just one. Cook the lentils properly with something acidic and something green beside them, or put the bitter leaves back on the plate, or crush the mustard seed cold instead of boiling the life out of it. One food, prepared with attention, eaten sitting down. Then tell me in the comments which one you picked. Was it Esau's stew? The vinegar Ruth was invited to dip into? The bitter herb nobody has ever enjoyed and everybody kept eating anyway? I read every comment on this channel, and if you want more of the physical details hiding inside familiar passages, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We post every week, and the next one goes further still.